some of the statistical tools that most of us that are part of the Zoom call take for granted, how they net out on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I'll talk more in detail about one of the models that our group has done to support some of the questions that the league has asked us, and also sort of to support some of the decisions that the league thinks about in terms of what we can control within the game of football. And then I'll also talk more broadly about ways to get into football or more broadly in sports statistics, because I'm guessing perhaps there's some folks on this call that would be interested in careers in sports. I'm going to actually start with a look back a little bit about myself and maybe where I ended up in football. This was a sport that I kind of grew up with. In the top left picture, I'm playing Pop Warner. I played at a small school called Bates College up in Maine, which was mostly the school that I went to because it was the only level of football where I could play. I wasn't very good. I was big, but I'm pretty slow. Then I coached, and that's the top middle picture. And then I ended up in academia. So I kind of had a path where I liked the idea of being a college professor. And that's a picture of me happily being a college professor. And then I kind of thought back when I was, being a professor, a lot of what I was doing was in sports. And so when a job opened up at the NFL to take advantage of some of the things that I, kind of grew up thinking about, the questions that I always wanted to answer within the game of football, things like that. That's where I ended up at the league office. The picture in the top right is a terrible cell phone picture. It has a ginger ale and a bottle of water in it. In the background is a graph that I made in ggplot, and it was the first graph that I presented in front of the competition committee at the NFL. I was kind of excited to be there, and you can see Steelers coach Mike Tomlin and Saints coach Sean Payton in the background. And I only mentioned that because, this was, to the best of my knowledge, this was the first time that the two of them had seen some of the work that we were doing. And it was kind of like hey, we're here. We're actually, talking with folks that we would see on TV on Sundays. The vast majority of my time is not spent doing what is in the top right. That's usually 2 or 3 days a year. The rest is sort of doing what everybody else on this call does most of the day, which is, coding in R, Python, or whatever, or SAS, and, plugging away and making graphs and fitting models. So, there is sort of the fun benefit at the end, even if it is a terrible picture. I'll cover a little bit about the growth of statistics in sports, because I think it helps give a little bit of context for where our group is at the league office, but also sort of where careers would be for students that might be interested in the sports side of things. This was, like I said earlier, I played football undergrad at Bates. And when I was around and a junior in college thinking about theses, I had taken one class in statistics. That was the only class that Bates had. And I wrote a thesis on baseball stats. At that point, to get the data for my thesis, I went to a site that eventually turned into Baseball Reference. At that point, it was called something else. I copied and pasted rows from each player's card. There was no web scraping. There was no automated way of collecting data. There wasn't even a CSV that I could download. I had to copy and paste using Control-C and Control-V every player from Baseball Reference into my local floppy disk, which I analyzed sports data. That resulted in a thesis at Bates published on December 12, 2003, that compared Nomar Garciaparra and Derek Jeter using, what at the time I thought were advanced analytics. In retrospect, reading it, it was, versions of correlation coefficients. That is to say, sports analytics has grown quite a great deal. Within one line of code in R, you could download the layman data package and get all of the data that I tried to get access to right at your disposal. And as one additional sort of context about that time, again, this is 18 years ago. This isn't like this isn't 50 or 60 years ago. This is the best I could do when I was in your shoes. I only did the players with the last name beginning with A and B. And that was scientifically chosen because Barry Bonds was my favorite player. And I kept going, copying and pasting in Excel until I got to BONDS, and then I stopped. So that's where That's where statistics was in 2003. This is the type of graph that I was making, and I look back and think that I could probably do a little bit better in terms of the metrics and some of the visualizations. My favorite part, if you look at this graph, is it's the default in Excel, and so you have like 0.3 just says 0.3, not 0.300, but then you have one significant digit and then you have three significant digits. I would not recommend doing that. Around that time, interestingly, and obviously totally coincidentally, David Romer, who's an economist at Cal Berkeley, wrote one of the first sort of real applied papers in football analytics, which is called Do Firms Maximize Evidence from Professional Football? So it was kind of like the start. It was also, folks probably remember the Moneyball movie. This is starting when people actually thought that this could be useful. And so some initial work came out in the world of football that sort of spurred the sport to where it is today. Anyways, I think it was an interesting quote that sort of sees the sign of the times change. Romer was talking about efficiencies in the game of football and specifically running versus passing, going forward on fourth downs is another topic that came out. And Bill Cowher's response, Bill Cowher was coach of the Steelers, was like, if we all listen to the professor, we may all be looking for professor jobs. Anyways, that was 15 years ago. And then obviously I was a professor and then, who got hired by the league. So that was kind of like my clap back to Bill Cowher from 15 years ago. At this point in the league, most every team has an analyst. And here's a list from Seth Walder from ESPN. This isn't updated. And the one team that's on here without somebody, which is the Titans in the bottom right, they actually have somebody. This is a list that is pretty accurate in terms of the folks that are in analytical roles on teams. I know James Gilman is a former NC State student, so I'll just highlight his name there. But you can see that teams in the NFL have anywhere from 1 to up to, if you look at Cleveland Browns in the bottom left, sort of 8 or 10 analysts. These are folks that have some to a substantial amount of training in statistics or data science fields. Most of these folks are on the analyst side in terms of the applied side of statistics. I do think it is interesting, though, that these are companies with valuations in the tens of billions of dollars, and they have one statistician, right? And that doesn't really balance out in terms of sort of using some of the data that these teams have at their disposal. It is growing. If I were to look at this list maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it would probably be about 30 or 40% smaller. So the careers are growing. I have a feeling if you look at, find your favorite team, if you have one, whatever that team has in terms of analytical capabilities in 8 or 10 years is going to be bigger than it is now. That's just the way that's just the direction that the sport is moving. So I just want to highlight that in terms of the sort of the growth of the sport, and also sort of highlight a little bit about where I ended up in my current role. Questions about how we do data at the league office. The sort of some different groups of folks that would be involved. I work in football operations with the football operations group. I'll talk about some of the questions that we answer shortly, and that ties into some of the models that I'll share that we build and we look at. There are other groups, and I've highlighted a couple of them. Player health and safety would be ones that do sort of experiments with cleats or helmets to sort of try and drive equipment or other changes driven by injuries. The media side in the bottom right, they would be looking at, predicting ratings, predicting what games should be aired in what markets, those types of questions. They're also the group that does the scheduling. So at the beginning of the spring, the schedule is fixed for the fall. There are data and analytical skills behind those, right? Like, how do I find the best schedule? And most of the, what is determined to be the best schedule is driven by competitiveness, but also TV ratings and expectations. And the bottom left is the Next Gen Stats logo. I'll highlight that just because it's an interesting and newer data set in the NFL. Each player has RFID chips in each of his shoulder pads. It tracks those players wherever they go on the field. 10 frames per second is the frequency with which that data is emitted. It's just really interesting because that's a large data set that football analysts have never had. And I'll talk later about an event that our group at the league office runs, where we try to use some of that Next Gen Stats data to crowdsource insight and think about new metrics and new analyses. And so that's kind of like where the league office sits. There are groups at the league office that are involved in a lot of these analyses. I'm mostly on the operation side of things, and that's where that logo comes in. So our job, at least in terms of my day to day, would generally be around the following sort of criteria: ensure competitiveness, and what does a competitive football game look like? That has a couple of facets that I'll mention in a second. Rules adherence and monitoring. So those would be things like, who are our best officials? How are we best using the replay process to make sure the rules are going well? And then also working with competition committee in the winter to figure out, are there rules that we need to change? Trying to think about the future of data in the league. So how could we use analytics and data and statistics? Like, what are the things that people want to see and learn about football? And how could our group help on some of those fronts? So I'll talk about a couple of projects that we do in terms of like where, some of what, my training as a statistician would come in terms of how we think about how to answer some questions. So this is a football specific one, but the question is, did a post 2017 kickoff rule change result in a lower onside recovery rate? So an onside kick is, and you can see in the animation, in this case, the Patriots are doing an onside kick. The Browns are the receiving team. The Patriots were trailing in this game, and it was late in the game. And so the Patriots, in order to come back, needed to recover the kick. And so an onside kick is when you kick it really short and have your players try and run after it. Because of some various health and safety initiatives, one of the things they changed in 2017 is that players that were on the kickoff team, which in this case is the New England blue team on the left, they could no longer have a running start. And so one of the possible downsides of eliminating a running start is that if you can imagine that all of these players on this play, if you took away their running start, what impact would it have on the likelihood of a team recovering an onside kick? So why is this an interesting question? One is tradition. Onside kicks have been a part of the game of football for years. Coaches have very specific strategy. You can obviously see on this play, there are lots of players sort of working cohesively to try and recover this kick. A second is competitiveness. If you are, implementing a rule modification that's going to prevent comebacks, if a team is no longer able to recover this onside kick, you might get fewer comebacks. Well, fewer comebacks could have a detriment to the overall league product. It could mean that when teams are trailing, fans tune out, right? And so it could impact both competitive equity, but also sort of the ratings and the valuation of the games. So this is a question that my first year was 2018 that we thought about a lot. And we thought about it in good ways and bad ways, and I'll summarize a little bit of those. Here's a specific example of new kickoff rules. No running start was the one that I highlighted. That's the main one that impacts recovery rates. There was another one which said that there could only be 5 players on each side of the ball. In the past, you could put an extra player on one side, and that could help you maybe recover a kick on that side. But we're mostly looking at sort of the impact of no running start on this recovery. One of the things you could do in just sort of, the basic analyses, and you can see I linked to a Washington Post. In fact, this is an image from the Washington Post. You could look at, do teams recover the onside kick less after this rule? So in 2017, there were 60 onside kicks. 13 of them were recovered by the kicking team. That's a recovery rate of 21%. In 2018, there were 53 of them. 4 were recovered by the kicking team. That's a recovery rate of 7.5. So you have this big difference. There were a lot of articles written. I'm linking to one here. This is a significant change by whatever definition you want to use. And in that case, that's a bad sign, right? That we're dropping our recovery rates by that much. One thing that we do a lot of thinking about is like, what is the best comparison group? And a lot of my training in statistics, my background was in causal inference, and a lot of causal inference is trying to find equitable groups. Equitable is the wrong word. Groups with what I would maybe call clinical equipoise, where what the characteristics in one of the group, maybe the group that received the treatment, are similar to those that they're matched with, right? The group that maybe receives a controlled treatment. In this case, the row 1 of the table maybe doesn't reflect the same type of game situations and whatnot as row two. So in fact, the next step that you would do is you would think like, what are our best comparison groups? And so in the NFL, you can have surprise onside kicks, which is when the other team doesn't expect them. Or you could have expected onside kicks, which is when the other team does expect them. So just sort of thinking about like, what are the best baseline groups to make that comparison. And so here's like a graph that we made where we show that, the black dot is surprise onside kicks. The blue dot is, the red dot is expected onside kicks. And when you sort of look at the fact that in 2018, there were only 5 surprise attempts and none of them were recovered. So a main reason that you saw the drop is that teams stopped this idea of doing a surprise onside kick. This is a very football specific example, obviously. But if you look at expected onside kicks, you maybe wouldn't see a big drop off, right? So this red line is maybe the more apples to apples comparison. You track that red line, it's not all that different. So in terms of thinking about, how do we use data to supplement decisions of the league, we have to really be careful about making sure we're comparing, apples to apples and comparing the right groups to one another. For a while, I was pretty convinced that this rule modification didn't make any difference, right? That the no running start teams were recovering them at the same rate. And this is one of the reasons that, we were justifying that decision with. However, I also realized that when a player doesn't have a head start running, they're slower. And so we also kind of realized we were sharing results without really having a great sense of whether or not we were right. And so we thought of some better ways to do it. And I go back to the tracking data. And so here's an example of all onside kicks to the right, comparing the average 2017 play to the average 2018 play. And so each dot takes a player who was at the extreme side of the play. So in other words, you find the player furthest right on the play and you average their coordinates on the play. You find the next player, average all the second players furthest in. And these are those dots sort of averaged over every kick attempt. The main highlight here is that when you compare players with a running start, they do get downfield further. And so we had all this sort of examples floating around, and then we looked at it and realized, the players are getting down about 3 yards further because of because of the lack of the running start. So the blue dots in 2018, they're just not getting down as fast. And I mentioned Coach Tomlin earlier. He was in charge of presenting our results to all of the owners and GMs. And he kept talking about the moving dots. And he would use the expression, we saw the moving dots. Everybody else was like, we have no idea what you're talking about. But I knew what he was talking about. Anyways, turns out that a couple of years later, we have actually come up with a better kickoff formation rule, and in part driven because of some of this evidence where we knew players weren't getting down the field as fast. If they weren't getting down the field as fast, eventually it was going to be a significant drop on the expected kick. So it's just sort of a process that we've worked through. And like a lot of other examples in football, it involves a decent amount of domain knowledge, but also some specific thought goes into like, what is the best estimate for us to estimate with? And we spend a lot of time thinking about those types of processes. Obviously, that's not a very in-depth example in terms of where we would use statistics. The next example gets a little bit more into how we would use some of our maybe more traditional models. Here's the actual slide that we shared with owners in the end of the 2020 season. The max speed for players was about 25% slower. The recovery rate dropped by about 27%. And then we tie it into things that they think are important. Fewer plays, fewer comebacks, more kneel downs. And that ultimately is how we've been trying to push them to rethink some of these rules. A second example I'll go into involves some of the aspects I mentioned earlier, which is competitiveness. So competitiveness in the NFL could be a couple of things. One is it could be, are the games close? Are there lead changes? Is there back and forth scoring? Are the games exciting? Another aspect of competitiveness is an idea of equity. In other words, when the two teams go into play, one isn't being given an unfair advantage for reasons that maybe are outside of the team's control. So some of the ways that the NFL schedule works is up until this year, teams played 16 games over 17 weeks. So 16 games in 17 weeks, that means you get one bye week. And if you get a bye week, you're going to be more well rested when you enter your next week. And so if you're a team that is facing another team, maybe it's unfair that that team has had 2 weeks to prepare for the game and you've only had one. So that could be one difference. It could be other advantages related to rest. Every Thursday night, there's an NFL game. That Thursday night team, so last night there was a Jaguars Bengals game. The Jaguars and Bengals now have 10 days to prepare for their next game, whereas the teams that the Jaguars and Bengals play will only have 6 or 7 days. So maybe that's an unfair advantage. There's travel differences, right? It maybe makes a difference if you're a team in Los Angeles and you have to play at the Patriots, for example. That's, you got to get in a plane and travel 6 hours. And sometimes maybe you have to get in a plane and travel 6 hours and then play at a 1 o'clock Eastern time zone. And so those are the types of things that teams complain about all the time. Maybe they don't do it publicly, but internally they complain about them all the time. And so from our perspective, we're often asked these questions. Look at bye weeks, look at, our teams that are rested, are they overperforming or underperforming? So that's what we're going to try and answer is these questions. These are really tricky questions. It's easy to answer them using maybe summary statistics and win-loss rates and margin of victory and maybe high-level metrics. But to answer them well and think a lot about how the NFL schedule works is not obvious. And I'll talk a little bit about our approach here. Here's an example of some of where NFL teams are, just to highlight, sort of what it looks like on an NFL calendar. All the blue, the sort of coded examples in blue, those are the Western divisions. And one of the things that's really, and purple is the East. So if you're in the purple, you're in the East. If you're in the blue, you're in the West. One of the really intricacies of the NFL geographical locations is that Kansas City's in the West in blue. They're actually further east than Dallas, who is in the East, right? So I don't know why the NFL looks at why our divisions are like this, but regardless, this is what they do. But as you can see, you can sort of imagine that the teams are traveling sometimes short distance, sometimes long distance. So one of our questions is sort of, is there any difference in terms of travel and things like that? So in terms of what this looks like, here are the things that we're going to try and account for. Team strength. The reason I say team strength is that we only play 16 games in a season. This year it's going to be 17, but maybe when you're playing a team and that team is really good, well, that's going to impact your performance in that game, right? And so trying to think about how to account for, each team's strength is going to give us better estimates and less noisier estimates of all these other things that we're interested in. Playing at home, there's a benefit to playing at home. I'll talk a lot about that because that's a point of contention for a lot of the folks in and around the league. Rest, I mentioned. Body clock, I didn't mention, but I hinted at. There are a lot of teams that perceive a big issue to playing times at different body clock times. So in other words, if Seattle has to go to the East Coast to play a game, they might be wary of playing at 1 o'clock because Seattle's body clock internal time is 10 a.m. Alternatively, if you're an East Coast team and you go to the West Coast, maybe you don't want to play a night game because that maybe fits into the body clock better of the teams in the West. So those are topics of conversation too. Last one is travel, right? Maybe it's easier to go shorter distances than longer distances. The model that I'm going to reference, and I'll allude to in detail in a second, comes from a paper that I helped write with Greg and Ben, who are two of my close friends in the sports and stats world. This paper is in Annals of Applied Statistics and came out in 2019. We used a state space model, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you're interested in sort of the model details behind it, this is the paper where we got this from. And this was kind of a nice example. A lot of maybe some of my work in causal inference hasn't exactly applied to what I do at the league. This is an example of something that I finished this paper and then the next year I was implementing at the league office, and that was really cool to see. Okay, so how do we do this? The first thing I need to give a couple definitions just to make sure that things align here. The x-axis is if I take the home team days rest and subtract the away team's days rest. That's going to give me a number, and I'm going to call that the rest difference. So on the far right of the axis, you have the biggest rest difference possible, which is 8 days. On the far left, you have the biggest rest difference on the other side, where you're less rested than the other team. So these are all relative to the home team. Most days rest are 0 in terms of the difference, because most teams play Sunday and then they play the next Sunday. So if both teams play on Sunday and then they play the next Sunday, or if both teams play Sunday and then they have a bye week and then play the next Thursday or the next Sunday, then it's an even rest. For lack of a better approach, we're going to do a little bit of binning of our variables here. I don't love this because I would generally prefer to try and take advantage of the continuous nature of this graph. We just don't have a lot of games that are at 2, 4, 5, and 6 days rest to really learn much about those areas. The bye is also a specific advantage that's only going to tie in at 6, 7, and 8. And so that's why we sort of split it along those lines. So we either have a bye advantage, a short rest advantage, even rest, which would be no advantage, a short rest disadvantage, or a long rest disadvantage, which would be the other team had a bye and you didn't. I should note, if folks have questions, you can, please, you can, I don't know if you want to ask them during, I don't know what the format is, but, feel free to interrupt, especially on some of the details of this stuff. So here's what the model looks like. And I'll talk a little bit about how a state space model would work. And it's a virtual format. And so I'm cognizant of not wanting to put up too much notation in text. So this is the only slide with a lot of notation on it. So after this, you really actually don't have to pay attention to anything. It's all going to be pretty graphs. And like a lot of what I do is making graphs because it's a lot more fun for other people to look at. But there are modeling details behind it. And actually, I think this audience is probably way more interested than the usual audiences that I'm talking to. Okay, so I'll go through everything on this graph, on this sort of one by one. The first is, what are we doing for an outcome? We've done a couple things in terms of how to think about this problem. The one we've had the most success with uses betting lines for the game. And the reason we're using betting lines is because in a 17-week, 16-game schedule, there's a lot of noise in actual observed NFL results. And it's pretty noisy to try and capture team strength and some of these other estimates using game results alone. We've done it, and the numbers are pretty similar to the results that I'll show here. But there's a lot quicker convergence when we're looking at betting lines. And so what are betting lines? Before every game, the betting markets look at all the factors that we're interested in. Team strength, short, long bye advantages, how far each team travels, those types of things, as well as which team's playing at home. And they give each team an implied probability of winning. And so, for example, last night when the Bengals hosted the Jaguars, the Bengals' implied probability was about 75%. In this case, that would be a 75% chance that the Bengals won and about a 25% chance that the Jaguars won. The next two sort of terms in my model are terms for each team. And these are going to vary stochastically over time because team strengths vary. The easiest way to think about team strength within the context of football is that if your quarterback gets hurt, your team strength is going to go down because whoever you have as a backup is probably not as good. And so we want to be able to capture some of that. We do know that when quarterbacks get hurt, that immediately shows up in betting lines, right? Because when Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback of the Packers, the team strength for Green Bay is going to be pretty high. But when the backup Brett Hundley comes in, the betting lines are going to adjust, and Green Bay is no longer going to be favored by maybe what they would have been favored at before. S, K, and I are parameters that are sort of subscripts that are going to denote season, week, and then I would be the home team, and J would be the away team. So theta sub SKI would be the team strength estimate for team I during week K of season S. We had about 10 to 12 years of data. I guess we're now up to 13, actually. 2007 is the furthest we go back. Our expected probability of a win and sort of thinking about sort of how to do this is like folks are familiar with like ELO or paired comparison models. This is kind of the basis behind those where you're looking at like the difference in the team strengths. This probability on the far left, this is relative to the home team. And then this difference is like the difference in team strength. So if beta for team I is higher than than team J, then team I is perceived to be the better, stronger team. And that would, as that goes up, the team I's probability of winning that home game is going to go up too. The next is a term for the home advantage, which is just a 1 or a 0. Almost every NFL game is played at an actual home stadium. So this will be a 1 if the team is home. There are games that don't have a home advantage, neutral site games, but those are few and far between. But in general, there's some fixed advantage to being a home team, but I'll show later that is varied over time. I mentioned the short rest and bye rest indicators. For lack of a better approach, and we tried some different ones. We're gonna, and you can see this, sort of see the definitions down below. These are each going to be either 1 or -1 or 0, depending on if the benefit exists. So, for example, the short rest is going to be 1 if the home team has a short rest advantage. If it's actually the away team that has it, then it's going to be a -1. And so, by nature, we're assuming some type of symmetry there, that the benefit that the home team gets for having a short rest is the same as the benefit that the away team would get for having a short rest. We do a similar thing with the bye rest advantage over here in terms of if the home team has a bye rest advantage, and that's a 1. If the away team has it, then it's a -1. And it just sort of all reports back to this idea that we're trying to model the likelihood that the home team wins. So I said it was a lot of notation. I tried to walk through each term without getting too into the weeds. But I can take questions on it either now or later too, if folks have it. The one other note that I would throw out is, what are we doing model wise? This is a Bayesian version of the state space model, and so we fit it in RJAGs in R. Each of the thetas stems from a normal distribution, and one of our assumptions is that our thetas will vary over time, not necessarily according to a random walk, but I'll show you some graphs in a second. But basically, we're allowing for team strengths to vary over time, and hopefully that is captured in the graph that I'll show next. So here is sort of justification for why we think this is a pretty reasonable approach to modeling. One is because we can capture how good most of the teams were at the time that we're trying to model them. So here is 2019 team strengths. One of the reasons I'm using this graph is because there's a team that really obviously got much better later in the year. This is the year that for the Saints that Drew Brees got hurt. And so the Saints are a team in the NFC South. And Drew Brees got hurt, and Teddy Bridgewater was the backup, and he came in. And the perceived team strength of the Saints was not as good. Drew Brees came back, and he was a start quarterback who was very good. And now suddenly the Saints are back to being one of the elite teams in the NFL. So just by picking up on some of that stuff, it's interesting to try and think about, justifying, this model. In most of our examples, it matches out that, the teams that we see as best are actually best. This is the year that the Dolphins started out, didn't win any games at all. And you can see their team strength, like they were basically, they're making me change my axis almost, right? They keep falling. The y-axis, I should point out, is the expected point spread versus a league average team. We're not actually modeling the point spread, but we can translate it back. And one of the reasons we do that is because it's a little bit more interpretable for folks around our league office to think about. But this is about as low as you can go football wise, when you keep losing games by a ton of points. But then eventually by the end of the year, they actually weren't that bad. And they ended up beating New England real late in the year. So these all sort of made sense, and it does give us a little bit of confidence that some of our other estimates will also make sense. One of the things that is also relevant here is before we even get to thinking about the impact of some of these things is just the question, are teams given unfair or advantages or not? And so I'll just highlight some teams that have kind of gotten a benefit, like the Chargers have had a disproportionate number of short rest advantages. The Ravens have had a disproportionate number of disadvantages. So those are things that we can maybe have a little bit of control over with respect to the schedule. Although ultimately a lot of those decisions get made by factors outside of sort of equity. In the NFC, this is a similar graph. Detroit has typically been a team that gets short rest advantages. If anybody watches the NFL, the Lions play every Thanksgiving. And so every year they're going to get a short rest advantage because they play on Thanksgiving. And so almost every year they get the benefit of 10 days rest, whereas the team they play next usually doesn't. In the NFC East, the Detroit Eagles and the New York Giants and Philadelphia Eagles are two teams that traditionally have gotten disproportionate numbers of disadvantages. In terms of how this netted out, just some rough estimates. The short rest, at least based on our model, is worth about 0.36 points to the home team. The bye rest is worth about 0.67 points. This is important, but it's also not that big. And so teams complain about coming off short rest and bye rest all the time. There do seem to be some signs that this matters, but it's on order of magnitude of less than a point. When within the confines of an NFL, sort of game outcome where the typical game is decided by about 11 points, it doesn't really move the needle all that much, at least in my opinion. In general, the home advantage is worth about 2 points. We did some more modeling based on travel to note that, the further you travel, generally the bigger the home advantage is. And so when you're traveling across the US, that 2-point benefit of being the home team, that 2-point benefit is really close to 3 points. Whereas if you're, the Eagles and you're traveling to the Giants, or if you're the Jets and you're traveling to the Giants, right? Just teams that are nearby each other, it's not worth as much. Here's those same numbers just in terms of the posterior draws. The short rest advantage, like I said earlier, was about 0.36 points. These are just draws from the posterior distribution of each of these parameters. So, I mean, in terms of like where we would use this, like I said earlier, we try to assess our teams getting screwed by some of the NFL schedules where there's disproportionate rest numbers, things like that. Is the travel difference, does that make a big difference? Those types of questions often come up, and we can kind of use some of these approaches to answer those. One thing that's happened in the NFL is the home advantage has dropped. And, this is just sort of the general average home advantage average across all games. It's dropped by about a point, so maybe about 15 years ago it was about 3.5 points. If you look, pre-COVID, the reason I'm not showing 2020 on here is because, last year, a lot of things changed. And so it's hard to model some of the game outcomes from last year without, being aware that it could be driven by other factors. But in the last year pre-COVID, we were down to under 2.5 points per game. And so some interesting changes that probably have a bigger context behind them with respect to team behaviors. I'll just wrap up with some final thoughts for folks thinking about careers in sports, and then I'm happy to take some questions. As I think about some of the things that we do at the league office that are either less sometimes or more impactful, I threw some terms on here just in terms of like, thinking about what I do maybe disproportionately to what I would have done in grad school, or been thinking about like, what does a statistician do? I'll focus mostly on the right ones. We think a lot about, and I mentioned this with the onside kick example, we think a lot about like, what is the best estimate? Like, what ultimately are people trying to answer? And a lot of times the folks that we're working with are not statisticians. A lot of the people we work with and report to have very little or no data training. And so sometimes we often have to think about like, what is the question that they're trying to ask? And to put it in a statistics perspective, what is the estimate they're after? And that takes a lot of conversation. It takes time. And then that often helps derive like, what is our model going to be? Because sometimes we don't necessarily say like, oh, I'm going to go solve TV ratings using this, or I'm going to go solve equity models using this, right? A lot of it is like, okay, what do we think is important to answer? And how can we think about the right framework to answer it? Similarly, like relatable metrics, a lot of times we end up putting stuff together that takes, maybe it wasn't exactly what we were modeling or what we were trying to do, but puts it in a framework that they're going to understand. And that's often driven because, our goal isn't just to inform, but it's often to drive decisions. And we want them to make decisions that we think are different, maybe using some of our data structure. We do a lot of some plots that I use a lot of. I showed some Joy or Ridgeline plots today. B-Swarm plots are versions that we do a lot. Part of the reason I do a lot of these visualizations is because oftentimes when we're presenting, it's nice to be able to say like, well, here's this exact point from this game that you can all recognize as good or bad or high or low or whatever. And that's often because like that's going to draw audiences in. And I don't always think that I made graphs in grad school much beyond thinking about like, how can I get this done as quickly as possible? But a lot of times now we have to, as a group, we have to think carefully about like, who is our audience and what are we doing? What are we putting in front of them? And that's a different thing that maybe I wasn't ready for coming out of grad school. Time is one thing we think about a lot. You know, I mentioned that we fit this model and then we have different versions of it. Could we improve this model, the state-based model on betting outcomes of games? Sure. We could probably make it maybe more accurate or think about terms that would maybe add some benefit. Ultimately, if we do that, we're going to lose time on every other thing that we could be doing. And that's a constraint that, I mean, obviously we're all fighting in terms of our research or our homework or our projects. But I always think about it in the context of, for us, it's not always about finding the best model. Is our model probably good enough to answer the questions we're trying to answer? And if it is, and if I have other things I could be doing, I probably will go do those other things, which is again, just maybe a different framework than maybe I was ready for when starting a job in sports. And lastly, just a couple of notes here. Like sports analytics, I mentioned this on one of the conversations we were having earlier. Like we're talking about companies that are worth tens of billions of dollars, but are basically run like mom and pop shops that you would find in like your hometown. They are not advanced in a lot of the questions they're asking and the tools they're using. And there's huge opportunities for folks to go in. And just being by, you know, having some data awareness, you can make a difference. And so like, I often think about like half the time that all I'm doing is just thinking about like, what is the best denominator? This is a response to, you know, someone who got a lot of, I don't know, I don't even know what you would call him. He's a public figure in sports, and he had something about the odds of a comeback, and he wasn't really making similar comparisons. So I mentioned the denominator. And then this is a similar one from somebody in the NFL talking about how many extra points were missed without recognizing that, you know, realistically, there are about, you know, roughly 4 times as many extra points as there are field goals in an NFL game. So in any case, that's just another lesson, is just trying to think about, sometimes just by thinking about like your estimate and your denominator, you can be pretty good. I'll close out by mentioning a league event we have called the Big Data Bowl. If you are a student interested in sports analytics, this is the event for you. In the past couple of years, we've run 3 versions. Our 2022 version is our 4th. It's live now. You can go sign up on the website Kaggle, which I'll talk about in a second. In the last couple of years, we've had 21 folks that have entered the Big Data Bowl, have been hired by the NFL or by NFL analytic vendors, have gotten the jobs in large part because of what they submitted to our event. It is also a way to get into other sports. So there's about 10 or 15 folks that have entered the Big Data Bowl, done well, and then gotten hired in soccer, in basketball, in hockey, because we are, at least to the best of my knowledge, we are the only league that has shared our tracking data. So this is a way of finding, like, you know, how do it's kind of like a hackathon, except that you have a lot more time to look at it. Our 2021 version link is up now. It's 2021 version for the 2022. It's like I don't know, it starts in the fall and ends in the winter. This is a picture of Kathy Evans, is on the far, is in the middle here. She is now the vice president of research for the Washington Wizards, and she was a Big Data Bowl finalist in our first year. Ideally, in a season, we host an in-person event. This is what it looks like at the Scouting Combine. I don't know if we'll be in person this year for obvious reasons. But ultimately, this is the you know, if you're interested in sports and you just want to play around messy data, I would encourage you to enter the Big Data Bowl. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions about either the stuff about just getting into sports or working in the NFL, or specifically about some of the modeling we've done. And thanks again to Professor Hector, Professor Osborne, and the rest of the folks at NC State for the opportunity to talk. And specifically, I do encourage everyone that is thinking about sports to enter our event, because I think it's a really good way to learn about data in sports.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So I'll open the floor to questions. There's one in the chat box. If there's, maybe we can start with that one. So Tom Ryland asked, some think that each time zone that is crossed requires one day for the circadian rhythm to adjust. Do visiting teams take anything like this into account when making their travel plans?
For a long time, they didn't. Now they are. So one of the things that teams have started doing is they've requested to the league that if they have to play the same time zone on the other side of the country twice in a season, they'll request that those are back-to-back trips for that very reason. So, for example, if you're Philadelphia and you have to play Seattle and San Francisco, you'll request that Seattle and San Francisco be played back-to-back. You'll fly into Seattle a couple days earlier. You'll stay in Seattle after the game. Then you just go to San Francisco and play there without going back. Teams are thinking along those same lines. For a while, I'll be honest, they weren't. And even within, I know there's a paper written about circadian rhythms and betting markets in the NFL. For a while, there was an inefficiency in the betting market where you could, bet the teams that were either facing that disadvantage or had faced it maybe the week prior to. So the markets are much smarter now. So I don't think that exists, and teams are smarter too, which is why they're thinking of those things.
So I think there's a question from a student. Feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I was very, I don't know anything about football, I'll be honest, but I was very interested in hearing about the marketing aspect of the effects of rules, right? You were saying how you want to keep games competitive because they're more interesting in that sense. I was curious because I feel like as someone completely outside of football, I hear a lot more about the safety issues. And I'm curious if you're ever forced to balance the priorities of improving safety versus keeping, market interest, keeping the competitive aspect front and center. Like how does that factor into the actual math that you guys do?
So every year when we present to the way that rule changes work in the league, first of all, it's a great question. I don't know if it's Kasha or Keisha. The way rule changes work is that clubs submit rule proposals, and then we're tasked with analyzing it. But there's also a little bit of leeway where we can kind of give a little bit of try to lead the head coaches and owners that ultimately vote on these things in the right direction. And our actual slide, which is a format we adopted last year, has 5 bullets. And what we're thinking about is some of the exact things you mentioned. What is the effect going to be on competitiveness? What is the effect going to be on pace of play, which ties into like media and commercials and things like that? What is the effect going to be on officiating? What is the effect going to be on health and safety? And then there's like what is sort of other factors that relate to the league. And ultimately, when we think about the rules, we're trying to balance all of those. I would say the easiest way to get a rule passed is that if it benefits all 4 of those, in terms of thinking about, it's good for everything. A lot of rules proposals are good for some aspects, but not good for others. And I would generally say that anything that benefits health and safety, but at least is a net on the other ones, will have probably the easiest chance of passing. Some of the examples recently, they got rid of the blindside block, which is when a player is running and then gets hit from somebody he doesn't even see. And I do think like I will watch back on videos of like when I played, and I'm not watching videos of myself, but like videos of football in the 80s or 90s, and it is actually much different. It's hard to imagine that like a lot of those types of hits would just not exist in today's game. So I would say the other aspect to that question is I think one of the league priorities, which is pretty obvious to folks who watch it a lot, is that the league is in a good standpoint from a competitiveness perspective if the quarterbacks are healthy. Quarterbacks have a disproportionate effect on the game outcomes. They play big roles in if teams are good or bad. And quarterbacks being hurt generally leads to our worst product being on the field. And so a lot of the rules have specifically targeted how can we make sure the quarterbacks are healthier. And in that sense, it's a health and safety issue because now you have healthier quarterbacks, but it's also, it also leads to upticks in some of the other things, that maybe are more driven by, less football-y things.
Thank you.
Sure.
Pranav, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. Hey, Michael. My name is Pranav. Thanks for speaking with us today. I had a question about the team strength betas that you had mentioned, specifically regarding the injury adjustments. You touched on starting QBs, but are adjustments made depending on conditional situations as well? For example, if a good rushing team is playing a team that's missing their best run stopper, would that affect the betas?
Yeah, good question, Pranav. It would if the betting markets adjusted to that. So if like Aaron Donald was out for the Rams' probability of winning the game, at least according to betting markets, would probably drop. If a player not as good as Aaron Donald were out, there probably wouldn't be a shift. So it's really specific to, in this case, the model is based on betting lines. So it's really just specific to how they react. And one of the reasons that we're doing, some of this analysis using betting lines is because there is that information involved, sort of embedded in there. Whereas, if the Rams lose Aaron Donald, but they still win their next game by 40 points, I still have a feeling that Aaron Donald is pretty valuable to the Rams, even if they won their next game by 40 or 100 points or whatever. So that's where we're trying to pick up on it, is in respect to the market movement. But you're right. It can be hard in some of the specific matchups in football, like maybe a team's really good at running the ball, the other team can't defend the run. That's going to be really hard for us to account for. But if I did figure that out, I'd probably try and go coach. So that's how challenging that is.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, next we have Eric.
Hey, thanks for a really interesting talk. So kind of on this, so you're using like a betting results as your response. So it seems like you're almost regressing on someone else's regression. So like, I assume Vegas or whoever, they have some home field advantage effect. So like, how are they calculating that? And like, why wouldn't we just use that?
I think that's what we're getting, right? I think our estimate of the home advantage is Vegas's estimate of the home advantage. And I think that's why it's declined so linearly, is because each year they're sort of updating their priors about, I think my decline was the wrong way looking at the screen, but that's why it's been pretty much each year, it just sort of goes down a bit. For us, when we look at game results, it's much more noisy, right? The home advantage is going down, but it's kind of going up and down, up and down, up and down. And I think that's probably it's one benefit to our approach, but you could see it as a weakness, because if there is an advantage that's showing up in the actual outcomes that the betting markets are missing, then we're also going to miss it.
Okay, next question.
Hi, Michael. Yeah, thanks for doing this talk. This was really interesting. One question I had, and this is kind of more of a hypothetical question, I guess, but I feel like the media talks a lot about trap games in the NFL, where, if a team has a really emotional win, you can think of like the Ravens, so they beat the Chiefs by a close score, and then they were favored really highly against the Lions, but they only won on that last second field goal. Have you found any correlation between that? Like if a team has a very, I guess, quote unquote, emotionally draining win the week before, that they're more or less likely to fall into those trap game scenarios the following week?
We do a lot of game modeling. So we have like, if folks are familiar with like WAR in baseball, where it's like a single number score that you would attribute to a player. We have like a WAR version of NFL game outcomes where every game gets a score. And it's based on a lot of things I mentioned, some competitiveness, some health and safety, some review, number of reviews, overturns, things like that. And we look at some of the aspects that you just mentioned. Is it a divisional game? Is it a game off of a team where a team took a long trip? What was the WAR of their previous game? Ultimately, and this maybe ties into the other aspect that I think Eric just asked about. Ultimately, like the only predictor of NFL games that we find all that predictive is the betting line and the betting total. It's really hard to strip out and find any other factor that leads to better NFL games once you account for what is the point spread and how many points are expected to score. And so, like the best expected game we had, I think in my time here, in the 2018 AFC title game, the Chiefs played the Patriots. I think the Chiefs were maybe 3-point favorites and the betting market total was like 58 or 60, which is basically like two really good offenses and like that's the type of game that we have a pretty good sense is going to be really good. Whereas if you take, I don't know, a game that maybe there's a 2 touchdown point spread and only expected to score 30 points, that's not. And so the only reason, just to like answer your question about track games, we've tried a lot of other variables in that type of modeling, and very few of them have any impact. I don't know what that says about the state of football, or maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. But I do think a lot of some of the narratives that you would hear about would be, largely media driven.
Great, thank you.
So there's some questions in the chat box that maybe we can address next. So there's one from Brian. What proportion of the analysts working for the NFL teams have bachelor's, master's, PhDs, and what proportion of these degrees are statistics?
Great question. I'm going to flip back to that slide here. So my guess is, it's going to take me too long. I would probably say, I don't want to make a statement that's going to be wrong. I think about half probably have a master's or a PhD. Of the folks with graduate degrees, I would say probably a fifth of them have PhDs, is my guess. I would also say for my job, here it is. Yeah, I would guess about half of these folks have masters or PhDs, and and I would say most of them are in fields that are roughly related to data science. You're seeing a lot more masters in data science students maybe than you would have 5 years ago, probably because that made masters didn't exist. Of folks specific in stat or biostat, I can name probably maybe 12 to 15 on here that come from that. There's a couple folks just purely in maybe pure math. There's a couple on there's a couple economists, a couple psychologists, sort of upper level degrees. And then I would say a lot of the analysts are out of undergrad, maybe with some experience, maybe without some experience, is kind of the list of who's on here. So yeah, I would say, I think I know of like 4 or 5 PhDs. And so if there are like 80 people to 100 people on this list, you can kind of probably roughly do the math. And then there are also people that I don't totally know their backgrounds, but I actually have probably met almost everybody on here. So that's just kind of the lay of the land.
Okay, so we're out of time, but we'll just address the next 2 questions here, and anybody who is free to stick around can do so. So have you tried to estimate home field advantage by team?
Yes. Yeah, actually in the paper I referenced earlier in Annals of Applied Statistics, we did it by team. And specifically, we were really interested in is there a difference by team? We found that there was a small difference. I wouldn't necessarily say it's going to manifest itself in big differences. And it's also hard to tease out because a lot of the teams that had the bigger home advantages, New England was one. I think the Saints were maybe another one. They often get put in primetime games. And then if you add like an indicator for whether or not the game's in primetime, there's also a benefit there. So it's a little bit hard to tease out some of that. So I would say, yes, there are small differences in the home advantages between teams. But I would guess by and large, unless there's like extreme examples, which there are a couple I can think of, most home advantages are probably pretty similar.
Okay, last question. How many teams use statistical consultants in game and for game preparation, for example, when deciding to go for a 4th down? And do you feel that if teams don't use that now, there will be an adoption of this practice in the future?
Well, I love that question because I would think all 32 should be doing that type of stuff. I think about 24, 25 of these teams have, and a lot of the people on this list are people doing that, have somebody dedicated to coaching strategy on the headset talking to the coach. I'll note one, Daniel Stern, who is he's called football research coach. He communicates with Ravens coach John Harbaugh and advises him on all 4th down, timeout, replay, 2-point conversion plays. And I mentioned him because there've been like news stories about him, but there's other folks on this group that do the same type of thing. One of the things that's really nice about Baltimore's approach is the coach always listens. And I think that's like, you can have as many people as you want that are doing it. But unless the coach is listening, then, it really doesn't drive as much meaningful change. But yeah, eventually all 32 will be there because, there's some complex questions that analysts can help with.
That also addresses one of my questions, which is whether people listen to the statistician. So thank you for that. All right, well, thank you so much again. This was a really wonderful talk, and thank you to everyone for participating. And we'll see you all in next week. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.